Hello. In this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the major statistics on drug use, or the prevalence of drug use in the United States. So I'm going to go over the Major Household Survey, basically that looked at all of the different types of drug use across a large nationally representative sample. I'm going to talk about some of the research methods they used, some of the research challenges unique to studying drug use, and then I'm going to talk about the prevalence, or again, the frequency of drug use, and demographic factors in drug use, such as age and gender and ethnicity. So the National Household Survey was an effort to understand the frequency of use, or the rate of use, of a whole bunch of different drugs throughout the United States. So this was a study on prevalence, or how often a particular behavior occurs in a particular population. And so note that this survey was conducted in 2015. Therefore, probably some of these rates have changed somewhat. For instance, we know that marijuana use has increased as it has become more legal and decriminalized in the United States. And we also know that unfortunately, there was a large spike in alcohol use during the 2020 quarantine, and therefore that's not going to be reflected in these data. However, this is still going to be far and away the best data set we have to understand drug use prevalence in the United States. So, the way that this study was conducted is they interviewed almost 70,000 Americans. They got Americans from all 50 states. They specifically made an effort to collect from basically all income levels, all major areas of professions, and they included anyone in the study who was age 12 and older who agreed to participate. And what they did is they did a whole huge series of interviews, both by phone and face to face. And generally, they interviewed everyone in a particular household. So, some of the unique challenges associated with researching prevalence of drug use is a lot of the time you're asking people to report on behavior that is illegal or embarrassing. So most people, if just kind of asked in casual conversation, how many times have you used an illegal drug, aren't going to provide an honest answer. Not only that, but even when these behaviors aren't illegal, sometimes they are a source of embarrassment for people. For instance, a lot of people are working really hard to quit smoking and yet find themselves unable to do so. A lot of people wish that they consumed less alcohol than they did. So the solution here to try and ensure quality of data was to make huge efforts to have all responses be anonymous and confidential. So responses were anonymous in the sense that data were never connected to any specific individual. So, for instance, if you were to enter the survey, you might receive a code number. So, you are participant number 423, and you are only ever referred to in the records as participant number 423. No specific information, such as your address, your name, etc., is ever going to be recorded. Confidentiality, on the other hand, is about making sure that the procedure itself is very private. So if the researcher, for instance, talks to one individual about that one individual's drug use, the researcher does not share any specific information about that individual. Instead, they say, okay, yeah, I met with participant 423, and participant 423 responded these ways, but does not share any information about that interview that isn't directly related to the statistics in the survey. So those two procedures, and basically explaining to people all of the efforts that went into making sure data were anonymous and confidential, helped to improve the quality of data and helped to improve the rate at which people were willing to disclose behaviors that are, again, illegal or embarrassing. The other major research challenge that you run into in prevalence studies is human memory is not perfect. So if you just ask a person, how much alcohol do you drink? Sometimes you get responses like, oh, no more than the average person. Which, okay, what does that mean? How much does the average person drink? What's the average person in your mind, etc. So the way that they got around this challenge is through having very, very specific definitions of terms and sticking very closely to those terms across surveys. So, for instance, one alcoholic drink might be defined as basically one shot of hard liquor, so that's an ounce and a half of hard liquor, or 5 ounces of wine, or 12 ounces of beer. And all of those contain an approximately equivalent amount of alcohol. Or the researcher might say, okay, so how many alcoholic drinks did you have yesterday? Okay, how many did you have the day before, etc. And then might say, okay, so was that a week where you drank more alcohol than usual or less alcohol than usual? And work that way to try and obtain estimates that are as precise as possible for the exact amount of each drug that people are consuming in the past month and in the past year. So, based on those studies, we know that alcohol is, at least within this survey, the most popular drug in the United States. So, it's worth noting that this survey did not actually ask about caffeine. So, at least of the drugs included within this survey, alcohol was the most popular. About 2/3 of Americans reported having at least one alcoholic drink in the past year. So note that this did include individuals ages 12 and up, and it included individuals as old as age 95. So probably the rate of alcohol consumption would be a little bit higher among young adults than it would be across the population as a whole. But across the population as a whole, Americans aged 12 and up, about 2/3 of them had one alcoholic drink or more in the last year. Nicotine was the second most popular drug included in this particular data set. So nicotine is the active ingredient in cigarettes, in vape pens, in chewing tobacco, etc. And so nicotine was the second most popular drug included in this sample. And about a quarter of Americans reported that they had used nicotine in some form in the last year. And then cannabis, the active ingredient in marijuana, is the third most popular drug within this particular sample. And about 13% of Americans reported that they had consumed cannabis in one form or another in the last year. Now, that one's a little bit interesting in that as of 2015, cannabis was actually illegal in most states in the US, and CBD or cannabidiol, which is basically an extract of cannabis, was also illegal, even though that has become largely legalized in the US. So, yeah, about 2/3 of Americans drink alcohol at all. About a quarter of Americans use nicotine, generally through smoking, and about 13% of Americans use cannabis, or again, the active ingredient in marijuana. So, if you look at all of the legal drugs together, even accounting for the fact that there is some overlap in the percents, almost everyone in the sample reported use of at least one legal drug. So caffeine, alcohol, nicotine, over-the-counter painkillers, etc. And then illegal drugs, across the total sample, about 17% of Americans reported having consumed one or more illegal drugs in the past year. And again, that's the entire United States. So it's also worth noting that this sample, there weren't a lot of people reporting basically strong, heavy, everyday use of a lot of these illegal substances. Many of the individuals in this sample reported that maybe they'd had cocaine once at a party in this last year, or maybe they'd tried heroin, but hadn't really returned to it. So contrary to the belief that these substances are only really used by people who are addicted to them, this survey found that most people used these substances occasionally, or again, once, and didn't really like them and go back to them, rather than being addicted. However, it's also worth noting, as the text says, in order to be included in this study, you either had to have a permanent address or a phone number. And therefore, if anyone was perhaps in a very bad situation as a result of drug use, and potentially was temporarily homeless or in another situation such as that, then the sample would not have been able to survey them, and therefore we don't necessarily have the full picture around individuals who perhaps are dealing with very, very severe long-term heroin addiction. So in terms of demographics, so again, that's factors like age, gender, ethnicity. So men used more of basically all of the drugs in the sample than women did. And they used more alcohol, they smoked more cigarettes, they consumed more illegal drugs. So on average, drug use, both legal and illegal, is more popular among American men than American women. We also know that in terms of illegal drug use, there weren't huge differences across ethnicities. So the only three ethnicities where they had enough of the sample to make a meaningful comparison were Black Americans, white Americans, and Hispanic Americans. And across those three groups, there weren't distinct differences in the rate at which illegal drugs were used. So then if we look at legal drug use, alcohol was most popular among white American participants, and then Black American participants, and then Hispanic American participants. So in general, the picture that emerges is that there aren't huge differences by ethnicity in illegal drug use, and that legal drug use is somewhat more popular among white Americans. So in terms of age, it probably won't come as a surprise to learn that people in late adolescence and early adulthood use a lot more drugs, both legal and illegal, than older adults and young children. So drug use, so again, everything from nicotine, cannabis, cocaine, LSD, magic mushrooms or psilocybin, alcohol, all of these tend to peak in early adulthood. So people in their late teens and early 20s are more likely to use legal and illegal drugs, and they're more likely to use drugs heavily when compared to younger children and older adults.